Test, test, test. Test, test.
Volume? Thanks. Sorry.
Test 1, 2. Test in the cafe.
Lecture in here.
Right. Taking your stereo.
Yes. No.
Is his last name pronounced Beshty?
Yeah, Walead, Beshty.
Want to make sure.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Thursday Featured Artist Lecture Series. Today we'll be having Walead Beshty. We'll be starting in about 10 minutes. If you have a seat in the hall, we ask that you make your way in that direction. Thank you.
We're all the clay people. Right now, spread out.
How much when you buy a bag of
Oh, those people. I don't see anyone right off the top here, but they're up there, and we go right after lunch. Yeah, Doug's up there teaching. Maybe up in Sophia's.
I have no blanket.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Come up. Check 1, 2. I was at 5. Hello. We're about to begin our presentation. Please take your seats. Thank you.
Welcome. Gosh. Welcome. I'll try it again. Welcome. There, that did it. Great. Hi, I'm Nancy Wilhelms. I'm the Executive Director of Anderson Ranch, and I'm delighted that all of you are here today. Before we begin our presentation, I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, Toby Lewis. I don't know, is Toby here today? I don't see her. But anyway, let's thank her. I'd also like to thank our National Council sponsors, as well as our corporate and media partners and other supporters for today's program. So thank you all very, very much. We'll give it a round of applause. So in a moment, I would like to bring up Rona Citron, who is going to introduce our speaker today. Rona is an energetic and enthusiastic member of the Anderson Ranch community. Yes. She currently serves on our Board of Trustees as the treasurer, and both she and her husband, Jeffrey, are National Council sponsors of our Summer Series program. Rona also serves on the board of the Aspen Art Museum, and based in Aspen and Connecticut, Rona is a thoughtful collector and a passionate patron of the arts. Please welcome Rona Citron.
Good afternoon, everyone. Bring this down a little. I'm very excited to introduce Walead Beshty, who is an amazing artist who's known for using various experimental photographic techniques and processes. Born in 1976 in London. He lives and works in LA. He got his MFA at Yale and his undergraduate at Bard College. And he explores the relationship between images and the world, basically. In 2006, in a series called Picture Made by My Hand with the Process of Light, he examined using photograms that recall the work of avant-garde masters like Man Ray and Mahalingam Nagy, and considers the materiality of photographs and the apparatuses that create them. During his travels, he was traveling to Berlin, and his film was inadvertently exposed to an airport X-ray machine. And then he discovered something that's become a recurrent theme in his work, that when you expose film to an X-ray machine, some miraculous things can happen. And this has been a recurrent theme in his work, allowing the traces of his own travel imprint themselves on his photographs. As he has written, photographs operate something like ruins. Despite their stasis, they are available to a multitude of narratives, slipping effortlessly between them. He has been shown in major museums all over the world, too numerous to mention, is in major collections of major museums and top collectors all over the world, again, too numerous to mention. And I could not be more thrilled than to stop speaking now and to present Walead to tell us about whatever he would like to talk to us about.
Thank you. Hi, thanks for coming out, and thanks Nancy, and thanks Rona for that very kind introduction. It's been a while since I've done a talk, and I've also been told that I have to keep to about 45 minutes so that you guys can ask questions. So I think I probably overloaded it. So there's two things. One is I tend to digress. So if I miss maybe something I think is obvious, which I don't bother to explain. In which case, if something comes up, just yell out. It kind of helps me stay on track and stay with you guys. And I can't really see you, so it also let me know that you're alive and enjoying yourselves and whatnot. And and then I'm also going to try to sort of give a bit of an overview and move through relatively quickly, and then we could kind of go back and explore things with the Q&A and what have you.
I think maybe the first thing to sort of describe or discuss is more broadly speaking, my sense of how art functions and my sort of approach to aesthetics in general. I mean, and I think of aesthetics not in the German Romantic sense, the Kantian sense of beauty, not in those terms, but in the original Greek sense, which is how something becomes perceived or perceptible, knowledge that's available to the senses. And that opens up a kind of understanding of art that to me was really helpful in the sense that it immediately becomes political. And I don't mean political in a didactic sense or in a propagandistic sense, but that art is always predicated on a community and a community of shared understanding of what's held in common. So aesthetics has to do with what's perceivable and knowable to a group and a shared experience of what's perceivable and knowable. And that creates inclusion and exclusion. In the technical sense of politics, from polis, right? The people, the members of the citizenry, et cetera. So it creates a kind of community. And I think of art as a kind of intervention in that agreement of what is knowable or sensible, what becomes present to the senses and is knowable through the senses. So in that sense, it's quite distinct from, say, language or other modes of communication, that it happens experientially, and that but it's still a knowledge-based kind of communion of a set of understandings, and understandings that we immediately share. So for example, we see a stop sign, we automatically stop, we don't decode it or sit and think about what it means, or else we'd probably die pretty frequently. And that's a kind of experiential knowledge and shared frame of reference. You know, so from everything to when you enter a library and you treat someone in a different way than you would someone who's dressed in a uniform or a policeman, these are the ways that aesthetics announce both subject positions, who we are in relationship to others, and what we mean as a group, and our group identification. Now that sounds kind of abstract, but it's sort of a ground for how I sort of think about how I approach my work. As Rona described, I'm showing a body of work that started in 2005 first. This is an image of it when it was shown at the Whitney Biennial. I couldn't find another install shot of it offhand last night, so this is what I'm going to use. They're called travel pictures. They were photographs that I had found an article in the daily paper when I was living in Berlin about a fire that had erupted in the former Iraqi embassy to the former East Germany. And it described how the firemen were sort of stuck outside because they didn't have anybody that they could get official permission from to enter the site. At that point, the CPA under Bremer had already been enacted. The Ba'athist Republic of Iraq no longer existed, and also East Germany no longer existed at that point. But because of the Geneva Conventions and the way that the territory of the embassy was given to the sovereign nation of Iraq, it remained sovereign territory. So it was inviolable. To go onto the site without permission would be an act of war, and yet no one was present. There was no Iraqi government to give permission to enter that site. And this really intrigued me as a kind of nowhere zone, a kind of, it was a place that was continuous with the topography of Berlin, and yet was a no place, a place that was sovereignty free in some sense. And the only people who could go onto that site were really there were teenage kind of like kids who would go drinking beer and kind of messing around, and everything was left almost like the abandoned colony at Roanoke. You know, it was just like books, papers, everything was left there after the first Gulf War when they pulled back the Iraqis pulled back their whole diplomatic arm. So this just sat there like a kind of Cold War time capsule. And so I was interested in the site, and when I went to go, I had sort of these ideas about reopening it because no one could stop me, and they had all the stationery there, so like someone could essentially go and reopen the Ba'athist diplomatic mission because there was no Ba'athist state to be responsible to. But when I went there, I realized that I had passed my film through the airport X-ray. And when I arrived, once I realized that this also was a way that the photographic film saw this movement across borders, which was really what was at stake. It was about the abstraction of international law as it confronted the reality of the concrete world of the city, right? The continuous topography, that these are buildings, these are places, these are people that have a concrete reality to them, and then law, which is inherently abstract, that governs individual relations but is not concrete. So that the film saw this kind of transformation, this movement across borders in a way that in a way that physically nothing else sort of manifested it, and that the photographs themselves were the direct byproduct of movement across borders, of moving into the international limbo of air travel, that sort of non-place where one's, as an individual, right, you think of inalienable rights, right, rights to free speech, self-determination and whatnot, and that as soon as you move through those airport X-ray machines into international airspace, ostensibly your rights are suspended, right? The inalienable becomes alienable. They are alien from you, right? And that's when that notion of selfhood, as it's granted by the state, as it's defined by the state, becomes present. Because of course, free speech isn't fully allowed in airports. I mean, you can't say whatever you like in an airport. You're subject to search and seizure. You have no right to privacy. If you're an originalist, you think you don't have a right to privacy anyway. But if you're a progressive interpreter of the Constitution, then you think you do have a right to privacy. Depends. But anyway, certain rights that you think are inalienable are revoked or suspended in those kinds of situations in direct confrontation with the state. And in some sense, the photographs manifested this, changed by moving through and into this other kind of territory. And that came the kind of tongue-in-cheek sort of title, Travel Pictures. And they were titled with the location of the embassy, which was 17 Tchaikovsky-Strasse in the Pankow district of Berlin, also with the dates of travel and the airports that I moved through. And I simply printed them and showed them like that. There's a group of 9. So I'm just going to bounce through those, but you can kind of see them. That prompted me, once I sort of became aware of that, it prompted me to start checking 4x5 film through my checked baggage. And just, so this is, and then I would document or write down the titles sort of have to do with the airports that I traveled through, and then also the durations of the individual flights. And it was just a way to use this sort of unused, this sort of byproduct of international travel. As an artist, you're constantly moving around, at least I felt like I was moving around way too much, and as a way to sort of instrumentalize both the security apparatus and redirect it towards alternate ends. And the history of the X-ray and the photograph sort of have a shared history as it was used by the state as well. And the Röntgen, who invented the X-ray, had a photographic plate and with his hand on it, and it was exposed by the cathode ray tube, which is the basis of television. So all media kind of congregate and develop these technologies kind of together. And they're a part of the same kind of fantasy, or not fantasy, but sort of same drive. Photography to index the surface, to record the appearance of things, the X-ray to see inside. So simply by reading these two technologies against each other, by letting them just sort of confront one another in a way that was against their grain, not in their intended way, produced this third term, one that neither was about the state or made some kind of statement about surveillance or not, which I'm not really interested in. I don't know that art is the right place to make some kind of declaration about politics in that sense, but more about the possibility to produce within systems of constraint, to use two things that seemed constricting, say the way that both X-rays and photography, say the mugshot or whatnot, are used as a form of surveillance or documentation, and to use them to produce a third term, something that was not intended by either, which are these sort of glowy kind of banded images. And each band, the X-ray moves in a sine curve. So each band is where the X-ray hits the surface of the film inside the checked baggage. I should have rotated these because it's more fun when they just match up just like that, yeah. But anyway. And then they're grouped by year. So this is a full year of them. So it was a way of using also, what I would also say is a kind of ready-made means of production, to choose something in the world and use it to alternate ends. So either to use the TSA to produce an aesthetic object, to try to use these real-world sort of constructs, these black boxes, if you will, to produce something that they weren't intended for, and to read them against what they're intended for. And that felt like also a form of kind of resistance, of saying that these things are defined or had a kind of authority. The third part, which was also mentioned in the introduction a little bit, where these were called pictures made by my hand but with the assistance of light. And all of these works that I'm showing in this sort of more cursory way, they all started around the same time, 2005 to 2007 or so. And these came from having a conversation with Laszlo Moholy-Nagy's grandson, this guy Dan Hoog, who had a gallery in LA, who was a friend of mine. And he was saying, why does contemporary photography suck so much? You know, it all looks like, and you know, to be fair, you know, there is a way that a lot of the conventions associated with photography, and I felt this kind of restriction within it, they were derived from like Neue Sachlichkeit styles, typologies, landscape, still lives, these sort of particular very constrictive and sort of conservative models of the Western pictorial tradition that were being used within photography. If you think of, you know, say, the number of photographic practices that are constituted by a sequence of like sort of blankly staring people that are like, oh, I photograph albino basketball players from Kentucky. And then you have 40 photographs of it. And I mean, I sound obnoxious, and I don't mean to sound so obnoxious, but to me as a younger artist coming up, it felt like there wasn't a lot of space. And it was a lot about trying to reimagine how could I use this kind of technology, how could I use this kind of medium to do something that I felt like needed to be done or actually made sense to me to produce. Aside from all the political implications attendant to that kind of photography, of course it arises in the early 20th century, a certain idea about the social world, the rise of fascism, the rise of mechanization of culture. There are all these kinds of, and imperialism, which are sewn into the origins of those conventions. So in a lot of ways, rather than perpetuate that, it was important to me to find some other route, some way around those conventions. And one was the photogram. And I had been taught, so he was like, why does contemporary photography suck so much? And I said, well, I always wondered why the avant-gardes didn't make a crumpled paper photogram. It seemed like they would have. And he was like, oh yeah, Moholy did it. And it turns out Moholy didn't really do it. He couldn't find the image. And then it made me quite curious about what a crumpled paper photogram would be, because it would be something that was about itself in the sense that it didn't propose that it was imaging something outside of the room or something far away. It was about the immediate, direct, physical relationship to an aesthetic object, to a thing. And that it was not about the politics of the thing would not somewhere else. The meaning of the thing was not about somewhere else. Like this is like photographers going to far off lands and bringing back trophies or something like that. That it was very much sited in the room. And my feeling about what was at stake in aesthetic objects is that the politics are in the room. How this podium makes me relate to you differently because you're all sitting. This is an aesthetic problem, an aesthetic issue, right? It creates a kind of hierarchy. Who's allowed to speak? Who's the listener? What relationship you have to me? These are all aesthetic things. So it felt like a way to re-examine the foundations of how objects and how photographic objects could have meaning. So these are all, like I said, crumpled papered photograms, and they were titled after what we speculated was the title of the Nagy work if he would have made it, which would have been Pictures Made by My Hand with the Assistance of Light, which came out of that drunken conversation with Dan. These kind of quickly turned into these fold pieces. These are just folded. These are exposed in the darkroom to a directional light source. And this is probably about 1-to-1. This is about as big as they are. And then I moved into color. And I was sort of curious about using a color darkroom because on one hand, I tend to think about my practice as kind of like a game, you know, and games aren't defined by a particular outcome. They're defined by the set of relationships that they produce internally. So you don't evaluate a game based on like one hand of poker. You evaluate it how it develops over time and the kind of relationship among players it produces. And different games emphasize different types of activities, different kinds of understandings, different kinds of social relationships. So I would start out with a kind of script of my own actions within the darkroom, and then a variety of outcomes would take place. So there's no hierarchy for me between outcomes. It's more so them as evidence of a particular process or procedure. So the paper would be folded, in the case of color, into a freestanding geometric form, and then each side would get one color of light based on the process colors or subtractive colors, cyan, magenta, yellow, which most printing processes from offset to color photography to anything that takes reflective light is sort of premised on. And the intersection of cyan, magenta, and yellow produces the whole spectrum of color. So it was, each exposure was one exposure of cyan, one exposure of magenta, one exposure of yellow, and then as they intermix, they create the whole range of colors that you see present. And these are just folded paper in the darkroom, and then they're unfolded and processed. So I'll kind of click through these. After that point, I had inherited a processor from University of Irvine, where I taught for a little while. I ended up teaching a lot of different places, but I was teaching there, and they were getting rid of their color processor, so I installed it in my studio. And I started making a body of work offhandedly called the curls. And all this, the distinction between this and the folded paper photograms was there was no folding, it was just allowed, photographic paper comes off large rolls, right? So it naturally has a tooth to it and curls in a way. So it was just curled onto the wall, and then between each exposure I would take it down and put it back up, and expose it to another color, take it down, put it back up. So it was another chance operation that was based on the way that the paper sort of behaved from its curling, and that would create this sort of spectrum of colors. And that's two of them together. That's a black and white one, and then that's one of the curls. You can sort of see these. And I'm going to show you how these evolved over time. These are all sort of, the actual titles detail how they were made, the emulsion number, they're kind of technical, I don't remember them, but I call them curls. These I call black curls, but that's kind of a more vernacular or not unofficial titling. The black curls, instead of taking them down between exposures, I just simply left them up and exposed them one after the other. Now the thing is, because the exposure times are very long, these are large sheets of paper, again that's about 1:1, I think, thereabouts. In ideal and perfect circumstances, it would come out as black and white, but because of different incidental issues in the darkroom, for example, the HVAC system going on and off, vibrations in the room, and what have you, you get this banding of color from the paper slipping, the weight of the paper sort of tugging on the way that it's attached to the wall, and so on. And it's almost like when you look at old offset printed books, when the plates are out of alignment, and you see a little bit of one color poking out from the side, it's almost the exact same kind of premise, that you would have a uniformly black and white image if they were in perfect alignment and if the circumstance was ideal, but because of incidental variability within the system and within the structure, you get these sort of momentary colors and things that peek out and disrupt it. There's another one. So as I inherited this processor, and it was pretty beaten up, and it had a lot of problems. One is the thermostat was irregular in the way in its functioning, so that it would sometimes stall out. It would overheat the chemistry or underheat the chemistry, which would create either too light or too dark. I mean, I don't really have a criteria about what is too light and what is too dark, but it wasn't functioning properly. So that produced a whole nother sort of sequence of these that kind of came out of the slow breaking down of this machine. The spools, the sort of rollers inside of it were going out of alignment. It would start jamming. These sort of teeth mark sort of images are from stopping the processor, trying to get it reoriented and so that it could keep going. So it's basically a photogram of the inside of the processor on top of the original images that I was showing you. So it was like another layer, but this layer directly related to the machinery itself in a state of kind of disrepair or collapse. And as the process kind of went on, you had more extreme versions. That's one where the chemistry was, in general, just completely not hot enough. Too hot. And then as we had to pull them out, and it's a pretty messy process, so then the handprints from a chemistry transfer from fixer getting onto the surface of the paper, so it became a kind of index of the labor involved in producing the actual photographs. And now we're at more like 2013 or 14 here. So we started in probably about 2007, and then we're at 2014. And you can see some examples of these. Again, the same size, 50-inch rolls, and then they're scaled to 1.5 my height, which is just a way in the darkroom to measure it. So I use my body as a scaler often. Around the same time in 2005-06, I started making these FedEx works. They're just shatterproof FedEx, or shatterproof glass, and either mirrored or two-way mirror. and or clear that are put into FedEx boxes and then are shipped inside FedEx boxes and arrive in the state that you see. The only rules that they have are that they have to always be shipped via FedEx. The only way you can destroy them is by trying to conserve them in some way, shape, or form, or ship them by art shipper. The tag on the work itself is the provenance. It shows the exhibition history of the work, and the more it's seen, the more the object changes, of course. The more it moves around, the more it accrues meaning and is seen in different contexts, the more the actual physical object transforms. The other thing that sort of, in retrospect, sort of interested me about it, it's also, FedEx owns that volume of space. They not only own the copyright of the box itself and the design of the box, but they also own, it's what's called SSCC coded, Standardized Shipping Container Code. So DHL cannot officially code a box exactly the same size. They can ship a box that size. They can't release an official box that's a DHL box that's in that size. It all has to do with pallets, filling pallets for on airline flights and what have you. But the perversity of a unit, a modular unit that was actually intellectual property of a corporation also intrigued me as a way to what would be an interesting modular, but a unit of space that's owned by a corporate entity. And that was also interesting to me. The other thing is that these things can never be seen in isolation. Not only do they change each time they're seen, but invariably you look through them, you see a reflection in them, the conditions of light change the perception of them, so they're not static, so there's no definitive way to see them. No one presentation of the object is it in itself, this sort of idea that you're seeing a discrete thing that's divorced from its context. It's completely impossible, I think, to see them aside from their context, because you're always going to see the wall behind them, you're going to see your leg reflected in them, you're going to see different types of aspects of them, and then each moment they physically change, depending on, from exhibition point to exhibition point. This is from the Tate Triennial when I showed them with an earlier version of the X-rays that were large. And then I also produced them in copper. Copper is a highly reactive metal. It oxidizes easily, especially based on touch and the various acidities in the human hand. So I felt like that was another way to sort of index and sort of have the invisible labor of something like FedEx, right? It disappears from where you're standing and appears somewhere far away, and that there's all this stuff that happens between point A and point B. Expansive networks of people, labor, etc., and that the box itself was comprised or made up of that invisible labor. That thing made the piece actually exist. And then it's not a work until it's been shipped.
Were these X-rayed?
I'm sure they were, yeah. FedEx X-rays everything.
Did they affect copper?
No, it wouldn't affect copper. This is a press release. I don't know why I threw this in here, but I used to comprise press releases literally out of the press reviews of the previous shows. So they were rhyming couplets that were borrowed from previous descriptions of my work. Because why add more, press releases are such pablum that why add new language, new gibberish out there? Why not just use the gibberish that's already there? This is another installation of these. This was a show in Malmö, Sweden, another instance of the copper. These pieces are called selected works. They're basically shredded, constituted works that I decided not to show. So they're a selected work in the sense that they're a selection in the margin of other works. You can see a detail. They change based on like what happens, what sort of work. This is mostly, it's an early one, so it's mostly photographic paper and inkjet papers and things like that, but some of the later ones have very different types of materials in them. That's a mirrored floor, and I understand there's one that's owned by the Phalens that's in Aspen. This came out of the idea of a work that's only made by being seen. In other words, it's installed unbroken, and then as people move through the space, it cracks slowly, changing and recombining what is seen in the reflection. In other words, it's almost kaleidoscopic in some way, and it's also highly reactive to the time of day and whatnot. So it was a way to create a kind of work that first was made out of the act of spectatorship of bodies moving through the space, and also constantly recombined and shifted the sense of the room and the reaction to the room. This is another installation of it. This was an installation of it for a show that I organized at in Brandeis, just to show you different instances when it was shown. And this is in China, Showed it there too. I also became interested in the way galleries manage their spaces and their choices of furniture and things like that as a kind of ready-made. Different galleries, depending on the kind of furniture they choose, affects one's understanding of the work that they see inside. So someone might have an IKEA table, others might have a Prouvé or a Kier home or something like that, and that directly influences a sort of understanding of the space, and in some sense colors the understanding of the work and a comprehension of the work and the type of place that it is. So I became interested in that as a kind of ready-made kind of shape to begin working with. So I replaced them with a copper surface, then they were used for a particular duration, and then those became works. And after that point, they were frozen in the sense of not touched anymore. And then I would also replicate the base of the tables too out of black powder coat material, so highly absorptive, non-reflective material coupled with the copper, which is highly reflective, highly absorptive. Then I began producing these works, which are also they're all called surrogates, and they have different kind of designations depending on the type that they are. These are only handled during installation and deinstallation. So basically just the kind of invisible labor used to produce an exhibition, to install an artwork. And the size and shape of the object dictates how it's handled. In other words, that it's a particular weight, that it's shaped in a certain way, means that the hands go different places to create stability, to be able to hang it on the wall. So this was the first version, which is just a straight, standardized copper sheet size, which is 5 by 10. Then I started producing these works, which are just bent pan versions. And you can see how just the simple form and the way that they're held changes, and the staining on the surface changes based on the shape, size and shape of the panel itself. And these can be installed in any direction on the ground. This is an exhibition at Regan Projects a few years ago, where I showed them. So also that they're totally variable. And the one thing I didn't mention about the photograms is almost all my work, except for that first body of work I showed you, can be installed in any direction, oriented in any way that one sees fit. I feel like I'm running out of time. Yeah, I've got 10 minutes. So I'll keep clicking. This is another iteration of it. It was just simply breaking up the standardized sheet size into 5 segments. And again, this is one install. They can be installed on the wall. This is another install of it.
Do you stipulate that they cannot use gloves, that they have to?
Yeah, that's the one rule. Yeah, no gloves during install. Yeah. And this takes me to the Venice Biennale, which I participated in with a group of ceramic work that I produced in Guadalajara. I spent about 6 months total there, 2 stints of about 3 months at a time. I was invited by someone who became a very close friend of mine, Jose Noé Soro, who had a ceramics factory, frequently did collaborations with artists producing editions, but also produced ceramics for consumption in the European hotel market and American hotel market, and various other custom sort of ceramics, all for export. And initially, the usual way that artists work with him is they have an object that they say, oh, make me 1,000 of these, and then we'll go sell them as an edition and whatever. And that in and of itself wasn't interesting to me, but I was quite curious about ceramics because I knew nothing about it, and also that ceramics is basically the most it has the greatest longevity. Of course, the oldest things that we have that are man-made are ceramic. It's basically just heated up compressed dirt, which is also kind of fascinating. So there were a number of things that I was quite curious about it, and that it was a very artisanal kind of handmade kind of industrial model. So when I got there, what I noticed, or what sort of changed my feeling about being able to do something, is that there was a multitude of sort of discarded objects, bits and pieces from previous works, either things that had been bisque fired and broken and just sort of left on the side, or wet casts and whatnot, a whole bunch of material that they had, and tons of it. And I got kind of interested in this sort of, this sort of world of, this kind of land of broken toys or what have you, this sort of, all these fragments that were the direct result of an international sort of, a globalist economic exchange. Because ceramics is really only viable on that scale in countries where the standard of living and labor and wages are low enough for consumption in the West. And even, the British are closing down. They're finally exporting British porcelain because they don't have enough, they're not able to produce enough, they can't pay enough to make it actually viable economically. So he was very excited because they started importing British porcelain for the first time to Guadalajara so they could start using it. So all of these sort of remnants seem to be about the the relationship between a kind of, economically developed North American, European economy and the way that it used economies outside and the sort of trade relationships, and also the relationship between the US and Mexico, which is a fraught one, predicated on NAFTA, and also the way that there's this kind of symbiotic but also potentially exploitive relationship on labor, and then also one of the other major exports, of course, of Mexico is the drug trade. 70% of the cartels sort of export marijuana, which is insane, and then there's also tons of murders there, which also grace the covers of the newspapers all the time there that I would see. And the funny thing is all the guns come from the US. So there was this kind of circulatory and bizarre kind of economic and socio-political situation that seemed to be distilled in microcosm in the factory itself. And I was fascinated by it. And I also became quite enamored of Jose Clemente Orozco did a bunch of murals in the Hospicio de Cabañas and also in the governor's mansion showing politicians accepting bribes as an official commission by the government, which is pretty hilarious. Which is also why Orozco never got paid, because he would, the government would commission him and then he'd depict them doing like awful things. But he was a pretty, and the murals themselves are amazing and underrepresented because of course they're not trafficable in the economy. They're not like a painting that you can buy and sell. They're stuck in that place. So he's sort of underappreciated, I think, in a lot of ways. It's a really key modernist figure, but because his work isn't portable and trafficable and exchangeable, he sort of doesn't get as much attention as I think he deserves. Total digression. But all of the murals were about the colonial relationship of the Spanish to the Mexicans, the relationship between the Catholic Church, also the Communist Party and the Mexican Revolution, and the sort of brutality and violence in the history of Mexico. And they all depicted bodies in different stages of sort of brutality, fragmentation, being cut apart. And that made me think of both the ceramics, these sort of bits and pieces, these ruins from this sort of exchange, and also the things that were gracing the daily tabloids, which I first saw in the factory. The workers were reading a variety of them, and they always had a cartel murder or a terrible traffic accident on the cover that was so incredibly graphic. I mean, like face half removed kind of stuff. And they were also very glib. Like one was a murder that with a big blood pool in front of a taco stand, and it just said carnitas, which I thought was so incredibly dark. And the other thing that they contained was pictures of naked women and sports. So all bodies being displayed in these different kinds of, kind of aggressive and intense manners within these sort of, and they also were directly the result of course, the cartels and all of that kind of violence is the directly result of this sort of international trade in drugs and the murders that are happening there because people are fighting to sell to a US market. And because of a sort of, well, whatever, I can babble about that some other time. But anyway, so that all interested me, and I produced this series of work for the Biennale, and also the history of Venice is as a global trading post, right? That's where the World's Fair kind of idea of the Venice Biennale comes from, these national pavilions that would show the goods and the things that each nation sort of produced. So it seemed to fit. The one thing I added to it was I asked all the workers to give me a cast of their hands, and I also included a cast of my hand, and just to make whatever hand expression they wanted. So some of them did the OK sign, some of them did fists of solidarity, some of them did thumbs up, a variety of things. And those are just put into the works. And I also used the discarded glazes. So these were just piled up, the remnants, then I would pour the glazes on top, and then let them bubble up and do whatever they would in the kiln, and explode and whatever. And there was a multitude, not only was it just kind of like pottery and different sort of plates and dishes, but also a multitude of artists, like there's a Baldassare bedpan in there, there's Jason Rhodes, there's a bunch of different people who, over the years, that Jose Noé had sort of worked with. That's a part of a Jorge Pardo there. And then this is part of the installation that was in the Scarpa Garden at Venice. Just click quickly through these. And then this is the part that was at the Giardini, and these were without waste glazes. I just did a clear glaze on these. And these are sort of larger works. And they were adjacent to the Greek pavilion, which felt appropriate. And then I asked them not to mow the lawn anymore. So they could be these kinds of ruins of exchange and what have you. And these are the newspapers that I mentioned earlier. And these are just sort of freestanding kind of loose collages. I mean, they're not really collages because collage, of course, means glue, but they're glueless collages. So I don't know what you would call them. But this was a project that was done at the Barbican in London. It was the full title, it's taken from a Hollis Frampton talk that was a defense of cinema in the age of video, basically a defense of anachronistic technologies and their viability or need to be used in a contemporary situation. In other words, that they become more apparent and more sort of incendiary when you look at an old technology in the context of a new technology, and more visible, more conscious. So that title was A Partial Disassembling of an Invention Without a Future, Helter-Skelter or Random Notes in which pulleys and cog wheels are scattered at random all over the workbench. About. And that was a talk from 1979. And what I did was I took all the detritus, all the paper-based detritus, or cellulose-based debris from the studio, and used cyanotype, which will bond to any cellulose-based material, and then imaged all the discarded, all the non-cellulose-based items onto the surface of those. And included in it are things like gallery invitations, receipts, my prescriptions are in there, ATM receipts, anything, everything. So there's about 12 to 13,000, I forget exactly how many, and the space itself is quite long. It was a huge like dioramic kind of space. And there you can see some of the details. And we would make, and they were produced every day in the studio. So that was like an old key, you know, there's an empty film container, all the debris that we sort of produced. And there were also 57 books, 57 volumes that had half-scale reproductions of every single object, front and back. And you can kind of see those here. And they formed a kind of encyclopedia of the entire project. So rather meaningless encyclopedia, but encyclopedia nonetheless. And as a byproduct, I produced these canvas-based works. I have 5 minutes, so I'll go really fast. That were produced from the drop cloths that we used when coating the cyanotype paper. And these I used for the show, and the show was called Marginalis, like basically notations in the margins. So they were works made in the margins of the Barbican project. I hung them directly just square in the centers of each of the spaces that I was showing in. So sometimes they obscured doors. And then also you can see on the back, we recycled the canvas from the props, the backdrops used in the theater in the Barbican. The Barbican is a multifunction kind of cultural center. It even has residential. The one thing it's lacking is shopping, which is nice. But it has like a symphony, the LSO is there, and what have you, and then they do plays and and they have a beautiful cinema and whatnot. This was also this was the press release where my gallerist there wrote something up, and then we passed it around the studio, corrected it, and then sent that out as the press release. And then this was an edition that was produced that was just the margin notes that we used, and he was a good sport about it. And then it's the rest here. I'm not even getting to like this year or last year, but let's just skip ahead. And I can also take questions as this is going on, because this is a show called Gastarbeiten in Berlin. And that was the first time I showed these machines and also these televisions that were drilled through. And this is how it started, by drilling a iMac a hole through it in a frustrated moment. And then it worked. And then I started drilling these LCDs.
How much of your conceptual information is known to you before you start working versus after you discover
There's like a set of ideas probably that make me start thinking about something. I mean, like with the drilled machines, I've been doing those for like 4 years now. So it's a slow accrual, and as you get to, you get deeper into a particular kind of work, the comprehension of it becomes clearer. So I would say that some premise is sort of there at the onset, but I don't really understand it until I've shown it, and shown it a few times. That's why there's so much repetition also in the exhibitions, is there's probably at least 30% that's older work, because that gives me a way to sort of frame and understand what I'm doing at that time. And I really don't get something until it's out in the world. Like if it's in the studio, I don't totally, it's hard to understand an art object when it's in isolation, I think. But when I start seeing it in various, the German gallery had a lot of fun staging these sort of in-process photos, which I think are just really adorable. This is a show at Petzel. There was a small show of the tables, unnecessary here. Did that answer your question? Whoa, okay. Zurich, let's get past this too. So I'll get to the earlier this year. I think I've overloaded it. Oh, there it goes. So these are fully functioning too. I mean, as fully functioning as they can be with a post driven through them. This is another iteration of the copper. These are larger photograms. These are just made, they're passed through the processor at the same time, back to back. So they're exposed at the same time and then folded out. So they're about 100 inches, 120 inches wide, about 14 feet tall. I'll show you a video of one of the machines, which is sort of fun. But please, more questions.
What's your relationship with Walead?
I know him. What do you mean? I mean, we're not intimate. We're friendly. Is that a bad answer? We're on a first name basis. What? We'll get the questions on a microphone. Oh, we'll get the questions on a microphone. But how do you mean? I mean, I've been aware of his work for a long time. I like his work. The video's not going. Huh. I think I broke it. Oh. Something's going. Oh, there it is, yeah. So it was in the middle of the space and it just would try to work. And there it's warming up. Echoed a lot too. I feel like I wasn't fair about that question, but maybe you could rephrase it in a way that I could do better.
When you were working, say, the Curl series.
Oh, microphone.
When you were working with the Curl series, for example, and you had a number of works at the end, and you were narrowing the number of works that you were going to put out to the world, I would say. You talked about two kinds of aesthetic, but did beauty play any role in your selection process at the end as to what became a work and what didn't?
I mean, in a sense, I wouldn't eliminate things because I thought they were unattractive. If things weren't working out in a way, I mean, I think seduction is really important with aesthetic objects, a certain kind of invitation to a kind of use or an experience with the thing. No one wants to be around something unpleasant or grotesque or whatever. Or there's a different, so I was conscious of wanting them to be seductive. And I think if something didn't seem to be working out, I would change the rules of the game. In other words, alter the system rather than pick and choose the outcomes. Because picking and choosing the outcomes wasn't so interesting to me, but trying to make a system that worked well in a lot of different instances was. So I think that's how I sort of would address something, like that.
What is the intended function of the objects that you bring into the world?
The intended function? Well, I think that they're they're more or less spatial tools, and then they create a sort of a way of relating to objects. So, the idea that a television could be split in half and produce a different kind of image than in what it was intended for. That one can use a kind of thing that's usually wrapped up tight, discrete in a black shell, that's just sort of closed off, and you can peer inside of it, that it can be turned inside out or read against its intent, and that can produce a byproduct that allows another set of relationships to take place. So in that sense, it's a kind of tool for the allowance of other relationships to things that seem prescribed or closed off, that you can rewrite those relationships. You don't have to accept them just because they're present and exist in a certain way.
So it eliminates possibility?
It allows for it just simply says that you can rewrite that script, I guess. That's how I think about it, is that you don't have to use things in the way that they're prescribed to be used. Does that make sense? These are body prints and then all my medications.
What kind of relationship do you have with FedEx?
Positive one. I mean, we've been working together for a while. They seem, I think they're glad.
Could go either way.
I think they're happy.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm any threat. Yeah. And then these are the ones I recently showed in New York. And again, I showed these copper L's. And the last thing I'll show you is this is an exhibition that I just opened at the Hessel Museum, which was called The Picture Industry, spanning 1840 to present. That's a Lawrence Weiner. And then, of course, the Lumiere Workers Leaving a Factory, which is the first motion picture film, or debatably, but usually called the first motion picture film. And I'll just leave that up if there's any more questions for the last 5 minutes. It's a walkthrough. And I think I might make noise. Maybe we could turn off the sound on this because I probably grunt.
You say that you reject things that don't work, and yet beauty is not part of your process. What determines what gets rejected?
Oh, it's kind of like if you don't, like, I don't know why I go back to like card games, but like, if you're playing gin and you're like, oh wait, these are just like these are just the sets that we already discarded. You didn't shuffle enough. You start over. So I think of it in that way. Like if I get bad results, I'm like, oh, I didn't do it right. Like I didn't perform the game right. But it's not about saying like picking and choosing an outcome. That didn't make any sense what I just said, but I was trying to think of, my analogies are really, epically horrible. I'm always bad at analogies. But do you get what I'm trying to say?
No, I'm not going to answer.
Oh, yeah.
When you're finished, I'll ask the question.
Oh, no, yeah.
Early on, it seemed as though you were, I would categorize just a photographer, and now it seems like you're more conceptual, mixed media. Can you explain the arc of where you might be going with this, and how would you describe your practice?
I mean, I don't really, I think medium distinctions are more of a question for secondary discourse, like criticism in art history. But medium distinctions don't mean a lot to me. I don't think that there's I think that they preclude productive comparisons and relationships and or discourage them, and also create relationships between things that are quite discrete and unrelated. So, technically a sunburn is a photograph, it's a light writing, creates an image of the thing, So there's not necessarily, or what's the relationship between a JPEG and a gum bichromate print? Well, very little, and it might have more to do with, say, a painted object or a sculpturally based object than it does with another thing that you call photography or another thing called sculpture or what have you. So I don't tend to think in media, so then it becomes kind of hard to answer your question about that trajectory because I see it all as really intertwined. I mean, I've written about photography with another hat on, thinking about those medium distinctions, but I generally think that they're not helpful as a producer. But they're helpful for museums. They're helpful for institutions that need to maintain and create a history of a discourse. And they try to use them, but they're quite anachronistic too. What goes in a painting and drawing department and what goes in a sculpture department, what goes in, a photography department. You start getting bizarre institutional perversities, when you try to pursue that into like the 21st century of like, who can collect a Wade Guyton, right? Is it a painting? Well, it's made on an inkjet printer, which is technically like kind of derived from a set of photographic procedures, and he used Photoshop or Illustrator, which is definitely not a painting practice, but then does it make sense to make that line, like draw that line? Is it meaningful or is it not? And so I have a hard time thinking within those categories. So that's my way of evading your question.
Let's take one more question.
Sure.
What are you reading right now?
No, sorry, I just have a lot of reading I have to do, so it makes me... well, I'm putting together a book for this show, and it's about 100 texts. It's about 900 pages long, the book. So I'm reading a lot of different stuff. Like early Scientific Americans that were the first publication points for Muybridge's experiments. I've been looking through a lot of that. Duchenne de Bologna, which is another late 19th century. But a lot of that stuff is really dull. But what I like that I'm reading right now, I'm trying to think of what, I don't know why that's hard for me to answer. I skip around a lot, and honestly, nothing's coming to mind. So that's, sorry.
Do you have any philosophers or game theorists that you refer back to?
I mean, theoretical, like people I find very useful, like Rancière I find very useful. The stuff on aesthetics I think is useful. To a degree, I mean, some of it not, but yeah, I think the foundation of his way of talking about aesthetics is pretty useful. I like Flusser, Wilhelm Flusser, a lot of the German media theory stuff. So Wilhelm Flusser to Friedrich Kittler. I also really like Bernhard Ziegert, who wrote a great book on the postal system, which is pretty amazing. It's an amazing book. But he comes out of that tradition of like Kittler, Flusser, media theory kinds of people. Wendy Chung, who's a new media theorist, is also, I think, really great. I think she's at Harvard, but I think she's pretty amazing. There's a lot of people, though, that are pretty good, but I think a lot of the action is around like media theory. A lot of the most interesting sort of aesthetic writing, I think, is there. Yeah.
Great. Let's take one more question.
There's 4 of us. 5.
With regard to your...
I missed one. I forgot.
With regard to your work that incorporates fingerprints and will continue to do so apparently, do you see an end game with regard to the condition of them?
How do you mean?
I got the sense that they are to be handled and the fingerprints continue to be increased, correct?
Yeah.
So do you just say that goes on for perpetuity?
Yeah, they're a kind of accrual. I mean, the other thing is that objects in general accrue meaning over time anyway. They kind of accrue different functions and different experiences that are somehow sort of wrapped up into the understanding of a thing. So there's a kind of analogy between that physical transformation and that sort of transformation in terms of meaning and its development over time. So yeah, I don't foresee a sort of, I would never say now we should stop.
And that holds true for the rest of the body of your work?
Yeah, I would say so, yeah. Oh, thanks so much.
Yeah, Walead, thank you. Is this live? Thank you so much for definitely one of the most dynamic and energetic presentations we've enjoyed. Yeah, thank you. Energetic? It was energetic. Yeah. It was great.
Maybe promise to photograph.